In more than a century, only 8 NHL players have scored 70 goals in a single season. 7 of those men are Hall of Fame icons whose names are carved into the very foundation of the sport. Gretzky, Lemieux, Hall, Phil Esposito, Curry, McGillney, Solane. The other guy is Bernie Nicholls. For having accomplished something so rare, he's a player who never gets talked about. He scored 475 goals, 1,209 points, more than others who got the call to the Hall, but he never got his. And what people don't realize is he kind of got screwed over a few times, in a few ways. See, he was on his way there. Then one decision effectively set off a chain of events that made him a statistical ghost, and in the process created a stigma that unfairly follows him. This is the story of what happened to Bernie Nicholls, one of the most fascinating almosts in the history of hockey. But first, hit that like button to show Pumper Nicholls some love, and subscribe for more classic hockey stories. So, Bernie Nicholls was never the chosen one. He was a 4th round pick, 73rd overall in the 1980 draft, who put up solid numbers in junior but wasn't pegged for greatness. But he would quickly make a name for himself. Playing on the second line behind the Kings' famous Triple Crown line of Marcel Dionne, Dave Taylor, and Charlie Simmer, he became known for his flamboyant, relentless energy. He got the name Pumper for celebrating goals with a level of joy that felt contagious. By his second season, he was already knocking on the door of the 30-goal mark. And by 84-85, he wasn't just a supporting character anymore, he was a force. He put up 41 goals and 95 points, leading the Kings in scoring. For the next 4 seasons, he was the model of elite consistency. 36 goals, 33 goals, 32 goals. He was a legitimate 100-point threat every year. And then came the move that would take his career to an elite level and also create the cloud that still hovers over his legacy today. In August 1988, the LA Kings changed the hockey landscape forever when they traded for Wayne Gretzky. Not only would this help the team, it was huge for visibility. Finally, all eyes were on hockey in California. And this was perfect timing for Bernie, a 27-year-old vet in his prime. He was about to get a lot of help and a lot of attention. In the 88-89 season, playing on the second line and sharing power play time with Gretzky, Bernie's production exploded. He scored 70 goals, added 80 assists, finishing with 150 points. Gretzky finished with 168 points that season, so yeah, the top 2 centers had 150 or more points, which is bonkers. Anyway, it wasn't a fluke. Through 47 games of the following season, Bernie had 27 goals and 75 points. He was on pace for a 128-point season. At 28 years old, with years left in his prime, he was building a Hall of Fame case in real time. And he just signed a 5-year, $3.6 million contract. Gretzky was on an 8-year, $20 million contract. There was no reason to think the good times wouldn't continue. In fact, when Bernie was thinking about buying an expensive house, he went to Bruce McNall for assurance that it was the right move. Bruce looked him in the eye and said, "You're going to be here forever. We'll never trade you." And then, the rug was pulled out from under him in the most cold-blooded way imaginable. January 20th, 1990, the NHL All-Star Game in Pittsburgh. Bernie was there, fresh off bladder surgery, representing the Kings alongside Gretzky. After the skills competition, Flames goalie Mike Vernon pulled Bernie aside and said, "I've heard you've been traded." Bernie thought it was a joke, but sure enough, he had been. The night before, Kings owner Bruce McNall and GM Rogie Vachon had shipped Bernie to the Rangers for Thomas Sandstrom and Tony Granato. So yeah, what was supposed to be a fun celebration of his elite status became a painful career turning point. Bernie awkwardly played in an all-star game for a team he no longer belonged to, meeting his new teammates Brian Leetch and Mike Richter during the game as opponents. And the entire time, he's processing that Bruce McNall had just nuked his life. His wife was back home, hysterical. They'd just bought that house, the kids were in school, and all this begs the question, why? Well, McNall and Gretzky felt that Kings were too soft. The Kings were 21-21-5 at the time, so they traded away a guy on pace for 130 points for muscle with scoring touch. And given their playoff success in the following seasons, culminating in a 1993 finals appearance, it's hard to say it was a bad trade for the team. But for Bernie, his career trajectory just got hijacked. When Nicholls confronted McNall about this, he was assured this trade would actually benefit him. The Rangers were a solid team in a market built for Bernie's energy. He'd be out of Gretzky's shadow. But as it turned out, this move made the shadow permanent. When Bernie moved to New York, his production stayed solid. He remained north of a point per game, but it was a far cry from the 130 to 150 point range he had with Gretzky. Even still, he got the nickname Broadway Bernie and seemed to be a long-term fit, but history was about to repeat itself. He went to Rangers GM Neil Smith, said, "Look, my wife is pregnant with twins. I'm about to buy a house. I need to know I'm staying." Neil Smith looked him in the eye and said, "I'll never trade you." October 4th, 1991, one game into the season, Bernie gets traded to Edmonton for Mark Messier. At this point, Bernie Nicholls learned the hardest lesson in hockey, that promises don't matter and you're just an asset. Neil Smith got his cup in 1994 with Messier, Bruce McNall got his finals appearance in 93 with Sandstrom and Granato, and Bernie Nicholls, he became a nomad. New Jersey, Chicago, San Jose, 6 teams in 8 years. And in the process, his body was breaking down. By the mid-90s, he was dealing with head injuries, the kind of damage that would later leave him struggling to remember phone numbers, street addresses, and even the names of former teammates. In a 2018 interview, Bernie admitted he had at least a half dozen concussions during his career, but was never diagnosed with a single one. He recalled one game against Calgary where he took an elbow to the face that broke his jaw. Coaches confirmed the break but never mentioned concussion. They asked him if he was okay to play, and he said yes, and then 2 shifts later, he got checked headfirst into the boards. "I'm pretty sure I had 2 concussions in a matter of 10 minutes, he said. These injuries affected his ability to play and ultimately his production. Still, when he finally hung them up for good, he finished with 1,209 points. Despite the volatility and injuries, he still averaged 1.07 points per game and nearly 500 goals. Now the big question, would he get called to the Hall of Fame? He was a borderline case, but players had gotten in with less. But there was one thing that was uniquely dogging him, the Gretzky Tax. Because of that 150-point season with Wayne, the shadow over his production had been permanently cast. The hockey world decided that Bernie was nothing more than a benefactor of the Great One for a season or so. Beyond that, he was just very good. He's in a sort of Gretzky purgatory. And here's why. You see, when other players who play with him for most of their prime get the call to the Hall, nobody puts an asterisk. For example, let's take the player selected just ahead of him in the 1980 draft, Jari Kurri. Now, this isn't a referendum on Kurri the player. He was legendary, scored 600 goals, two-way player, 5 cups, Lady Bing, one of the best to ever do it. But when we talk about the Gretzky Tax, how can we not mention that Kurri played on Gretzky's wing for the majority of his prime? He benefited directly from the most prolific playmaker and scorer in the history of the game for a decade. Kurri finished with 1,398 points in 1,251 games and was a first ballot Hall of Famer in 2001. The Gretzky Tax didn't seem to affect him at all, but because Bernie had his best production for only 1.5 seasons, there's contrast. If Bernie stays in LA for those 5 seasons with Gretzky, as he was contracted to do, he almost certainly hits 1,300 to 1,400 points and 500 goals. Instead of being the player with the most points not to be in the Hall of Fame, he's in there for sure with Kurri and others, like Kevin Lowe, who spent their careers with the Great One. And in that lies one of the most interesting what-ifs and complicated legacies in hockey history. The guy who is so close to the Hall with just a little bit of Gretzky gets dismissed from benefiting from Gretzky. Now, the hockey gods do have a funny way of balancing the scales. In 2012, 22 years after he was cold-bloodedly traded away from LA, he returned to the Kings as a coaching consultant. When the Kings hoisted their first ever Stanley Cup that June, Bernie Nicholls was right there. He finally got his ring. The organization that promised he'd never be traded now lives in their history forever as a champion. And in the end, to Bernie, despite all the rug pulls and unfair assessments of his career, that might be the only thing that matters.